Hi, I'm Conrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, a magazine for your ears featuring in-depth conversations with fascinating people from sport and politics, science and culture, business and beyond. Every week you can download new episodes in which top journalists from across our newsrooms talk to compelling people about the definitive stories of the day. In this episode, we talk to Mark Brandi, the author of 5 crime novels, starting with Wimmera, which was published in 2017 and won the prestigious British Crime Writers Association debut Dagger Award, writes about outsiders, heroin addicts, former prisoners, and child victims of poverty and violence. Brandi talks to us today to chat about his new book, Eden, being released on June 25th. But we also take a look at his family background, including the racist small-town harassment of his father, plus his career in corrective services, both of which shed light on why he's drawn to people on the margins. And hosting this conversation about everything from growing up inside a country pub to working in the criminal justice system and how good and bad luck changed Brandi's life is freelance writer Nicole Abadee.
Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Nicole.
You have written 5 crime novels, starting with the multi-award-winning Wimmera, published in 2017. Your 5th, Eden, will be out in July. What I'm interested in is the subject matter. All of them are about people who are outsiders, people at the margins. They're heroin addicts, they're former prisoners, they're child victims of poverty and sexual assault. And I want to just explore with you what it is in your background that's led you to write about that sort of subject matter. It seems to me that there's 2 things. I'm going to ask you about them in order. The first is your childhood, your background, and the harassment that your parents suffered in their pub in the 80s. And the second is your work that you did in corrective services. So let's start with the first, your background. Your parents, Tommaso and Thomasina, arrived in Victoria from Italy in the 1960s. Your dad was originally a train driver, but in 1964 he had an accident. What happened, and how did he become a part of Australia's legal history?
Dad, as you say, he was a train driver on the Victorian Railways. He drove goods trains around Victoria, which he really loved that job, seeing the state. And one day he was on his way to work. He was on Victoria Parade in Melbourne, and he was at an intersection, and a car crashed into him. And I think this was the days before seatbelts or anything like that were mandatory. So it was quite a bad accident, and he was quite badly injured, his back and his neck. And as a consequence of that, his doctor told him that he could no longer work as a train driver because of the movement of the trains, the shunting. It just wasn't suitable for him anymore. And those were the days, I suppose, before TAC or anything like that, any kind of insurance scheme. There was no work cover or anything, so he just had to find another job. So he went out initially and he became a door-to-door salesman. He was selling cookware. I think it was called Arenaware. It was this stainless steel cookware door-to-door. And he did that for a couple of years. He was pretty good at it. He loved that job too. He used to have a kind of velvet cloth he would roll out on their table and put the cookware there. So he was going door to door, but at the same time, he was still getting medical treatment for his back and his neck. And he was seeing a doctor, this guy, Dr. Lawrence, and one day he was in his rooms in a consultation, and the doctor happened to be on the phone, and he was talking to someone about this pub that he owned in the country that he was trying to lease out. People had shot through, and Dad was listening to the conversation and eventually got off the phone, and Dad asked him, what's this pub you've got? And Dr. Lawrence said, I've got this pub in Stawell in Western Victoria. These people shot through about 6 months ago. It's quite run down, but, Tom, have you ever thought about running a pub? And Dad, at that point, he'd never set foot in a pub, coming from Italy, there wasn't really a drinking culture. No, not at all. So I don't know what came over him, but he said, I'd be interested to have a look. So the next day they got in the car, in Dr. Lawrence's car, drove down to Stawell, and Dad had a look around the pub. It was just, rat infested, really run down. And he decided to buy it. He bought it on the spot.
we're going to talk about that, but I'm going to take you back to the legal part. I'm an ex-lawyer and I know you've worked in the legal area. Your dad made history by being almost wasn't he the first person to represent himself and win in the High Court in a case that ended up being called Brandi and Mingo, 1976?
Yes. So we believe that is the case. I have contacted the High Court about it previously. They weren't able to confirm it, but it seems fairly likely if he wasn't the first that he was one of the first. And essentially what happened, he sued the driver and the driver's insurer over the accident. He wanted his medical expenses covered, plus the loss of earnings that he'd suffered as a result of having to leave his job on the railways, which was quite a well-paying job at the time. And he went engaged lawyers. His lawyer was actually Frank Costigan, who
wow,
yeah,
Costigan Commission, Costigan
exactly,
Royal Commission, yeah,
who my mum sort of recollects as just being the loveliest man. He was just a lovely man to deal with. And they went to the Supreme Court. It was a jury trial, and they were unsuccessful. And basically, from what I understand, the case hinged on was about whether a particular witness was called, a medical witness, and whether the jury could draw an adverse inference about my dad's case on the basis that he didn't call that, or his lawyers didn't call that expert. And essentially, it got appealed and went to the High Court. So when it went to the High Court, my dad and my mum were back in Italy at the time. They'd gone back to work a piece of land over there. And Dad got the call from the registrar, I think, of the High Court saying that the case has been listed. Meanwhile, for reasons unknown, Dad had sacked his lawyer, had sacked Frank Costigan. And so he was trying to arrange to get another lawyer, but it was a very short space of time. I think it was only a week before it was due to go to court. So Dad got on a plane and came back to Melbourne and fronted up in the courtroom himself.
And this is, I did a little bit of research to try and track it down. So this was in 1975. It was before you were born. Mm. And it just sounds like The Castle, the story of the Castle. Your dad represents himself in the High Court against an insurance company and their lawyers, and he wins.
It's quite amazing to me. I mean, in saying that, it's not that amazing because I know the sort of guy that Dad was, and he just had this unwavering self-belief. And if he felt like he was on the right side of something and then there'd been an injustice done, he wanted to, have his victory. And
I reckon there's a story in there for you, Mark. I reckon there's another book in there for you in that story. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, perhaps one day. I've threatened my family with writing a memoir before, but it might happen. But I think he did have the benefit of having legally prepared documents with him at the time, so he wasn't flying completely solo either. But to have the front to do that, I find it quite amazing. And I think afterwards, one of the courtroom staff told him, you've made history here today. Mike Willisey wanted to interview him, I think, on this day tonight. But Dad was, he was just happy to have his win. And he certainly dined out on that story for many, many years afterwards.
Now, Mark, that was before you were born. You were born in 1978 and you were the fourth boy, the fourth son. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about what it was like for you growing up in rural Victoria, where the pub was, in the 1980s as the fourth son of Italian migrants.
Look, there was really great aspects to growing up in the country. Like it was that kind of bucolic cliche in some ways, where your parents kind of let you out the front door in the morning, and as long as you're back by night, everything's okay. We went rabbiting, fishing, yabbying, all that kind of stuff. So that was all great. I guess the flip side of it was being in a very a small town of about 6,000 or 7,000 people, which was very Anglo-Saxon. We were the only Italian family that I know of in the town, and that was tough. I think the attitudes in in the 80s were very different in rural places in Australia than in the city, because I know I had cousins in Melbourne who had a very different kind of experience. They had their tribe with them, essentially. There was a lot of other Italians and a lot of support and a lot of culture. And that was very different in the country. In the schoolyard in particular, I found it pretty tough for the first couple of years.
Kids called you names, didn't they?
Yeah. I couldn't make any friends, and some of the kids would say to me, my dad told me not to be friends with you because you're a wog.
Yeah.
And that was tough. I suppose I internalized a lot of that experience, because I think when you're a kid, you can't really contextualize the situation. You can't sort of say, oh, well, these people have not been exposed to much, they're a product of their environment or anything like that. All you start to think is, there's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with me.
And do you think that experience, that childhood experience of being at least slightly, might be overstating, but slightly ostracised, has that fed into your interest in writing about people that are outsiders in a lot of ways?
I believe so. I think the other aspect to it is, when you are on the outside and you want to be accepted, you start to observe people really closely, because I was watching kids in the schoolyard, how they spoke, what they talked about, which footy team they barracked for, all that sort of stuff. And so that close kind of observational skill helped me. I think definitely being an outsider myself perhaps created a greater degree of empathy for others who are on the margins themselves. I would say too that in the pub, country pubs are great places, because you do meet people from all walks of life. You have farmers coming in, police officers, chronic alcoholics, unemployed, criminals, low-level criminals. And it's a very democratic kind of environment. And my dad always impressed upon me when I got a bit older and I started to work behind the bar. He said, talk to people. Don't make judgments about people based on how they look or anything like that. Talk to them, because everyone's got a story and they want to share it. And that's what I found over time. You'd listen to some of these people who others might have looked at and thought, they're a bit rough around the edges, and the way it is in country towns, like if you do kind of one or two things quote unquote wrong, everyone knows about it. And so you're kind of marked for life. But what I found was that those people often had the most interesting stories. So I think that really sparked something inside me, which, when I went to choose a career, but also when I sat down to write, affected the kind of subject matter that I was drawn to.
So your parents were really successful. They made a real go of this pub. They'd been doing it since the 1960s, and then in the 1980s, they started to be harassed by the local police, and eventually they were actually raided by the Vice Squad. What happened? Tell us about that.
Yeah, look, in the 80s, we're hearing a lot of rumours in town coming back that we were dealing drugs from the pub, like my brothers were dealing drugs from the toilets and all this sort of stuff, which, my parents didn't pay much heed to, because you hear a lot of gossip in small towns. But then the police started to take a very keen interest in the pub for reasons unknown. They would show up regularly, park their divvy van across the front door, come in, be checking patrons' IDs, checking our security logbooks. It was just relentless, and checking we've got fire exits clear. And I think that looking back on it, I could see it was just an effort to put pressure on my parents in that environment. But it really culminated in, I think it was the mid-'80s, around 1985, when one night there was a whole lot of strangers in the bar, essentially people from out of town, which is always really conspicuous in a country pub. There was a group of guys, and they were quite rowdy. They were drinking quite heavily.
And as the night progressed, they became more and more rowdy and started provoking some of the customers to violence. And in the end, they pulled out their badges and said they were from the police.
So they were undercover cops?
Yeah, they were undercover. And they started to arrest patrons indiscriminately. They grabbed, people off their bar stools by their hair, pulled them on the ground.
Were you there?
Assaulted.
Did you see this happening, Mark?
I was upstairs at the time, so I heard the sound of it, which was terrifying, I would say. You could hear yelling.
So you were about 8, I guess.
Yeah. So, and they took a lot of the patrons off to the police station, put them in the cells. And the police showed up the next morning at the front door of the pub. And my mum looked out the window at the time, saw them, and said to my dad, "Don't go down there," because she was worried that he was going to get assaulted and taken off to a jail cell as well. So they then they charged my father with a whole slew of charges for breaches of his license, serving patrons intoxicated, various other things. But when it went to court, their lawyer, I think they realised that they couldn't make a lot of it stick. And so they did a plea deal. My dad's lawyer did a plea deal essentially that he would plead guilty to one charge. And
tell us what it was.
That charge was for having illegal gambling on the premises, which was for having a footy tipping competition on the wall, which every single pub in town, if not Victoria, had at that time. And in fact, my dad's lawyer said to the magistrate, I believe the Stawell Magistrates Court has a tipping competition, and the magistrate said, yes, it does. So,
yeah.
It was just, I think they were dead keen to drive my dad out of business for reasons unknown. I don't know how much race came into it.
I was going to ask you about that because I've heard you mention this before, and you've said it was the time of Robert Trimboli. Just talk a little bit about him for listeners who aren't familiar with him and what that 1980s, that context was that made them really, it certainly seemed like it was racism and targeted because your family were Italian.
Yeah, I think there was like Robert Trimboli, who was involved in the drug trade, I think in Griffith. And, it was a very prominent mafia figure. And I think there was a perception that Italians, particularly Italians that were doing well, might have some sort of link to organised crime. I think those kinds of beliefs can take hold, particularly in a small town where people aren't exposed to a lot of other cultures and a lot of other Italians who might be doing well and who are law-abiding people and things like that. So I think the atmosphere was such that it was easy for that kind of prejudice to form. It's just, to me, it's kind of, it's crazy because like my dad is just the most, was the most clean living person you could imagine. My brothers too, they all ended up working in law enforcement for that matter. So
for the police, all three of them ended up working for the police, didn't they?
Yes, yeah, that's right. My eldest brother was he's a forensic scientist and he worked for Victoria Police and for the AFP as well. My second eldest brother, he's a lawyer. He's a sergeant with Victoria Police in their civil litigation branch, and my next eldest brother, he works in the criminal records branch of Victoria Police. So, we were not a criminal enterprise in our family. We're very far removed from it. So, it's kind of baffling how that happened, but it was just unbelievably stressful for my family, for my parents.
And they kept harassing you, didn't they? Even after that raid by the Vice Squad, the harassment kept going for some time.
Yes, yeah. And it really led my parents to sell the lease on the pub a few times just to get out and have a break, from that. And that was a bit of pill for my dad because my dad, he loved running that pub, that was his
his life. He loved the hotel. He loved being able to provide a good service to the local community. You know, my mum was the cook in the pub. We'd get bands in from out of town. And, it was a huge part of his life. So I think that it really affected him longer term and his sense of self in a lot of ways.
So I'm interested in the impact on you. You then started, when you finished school, you started a degree in law, but you stopped that. You ended up working for 10 years in the criminal justice system. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that. I know one of the jobs you had was as a political advisor to the corrections minister, but I wanted you to tell us a little bit about that work and how you enjoyed it up until a point that you made a change in your life, which we'll come to.
Yes. As you say, I studied law initially, and then I dropped out of that and kind of rolled through a few different attempts at degrees, and ranging from psychology. I did a massage course at one point. I did all sorts of odd things, but predominantly I was doing bar work, and I think I just got to a point where I figured I've accumulated this enormous HECS debt and I need to actually try to get a degree and get a decent job. So I studied criminal justice at RMIT, which I
now that's the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology.
That's right. And I loved that course. I suppose because of what my brothers were doing for a living, I'd been, immersed in these kind of crime stories and these really, like, as you know, like the law is just fascinating and it's just full of drama and kind of, good versus evil, quote unquote. But I loved those stories and it really interested me. So I went into this course and it was great. We really learned a lot about the kind of social determinants of crime, why it is we label people deviants, a lot of the philosophy behind it. And I suppose I didn't know what would come of it. I just enjoyed the subject matter, really applied myself for the first time in years, and I ended up getting a placement at Department of Justice, where I had a variety of roles over the years in policy, multicultural policy, disability policy. I worked in emergency services, gambling licensing, all sorts of stuff. And I think I kind of went into it a little bit as a crusader, like I wanted to make a difference. And I think that was partly born, I wasn't conscious of it at the time, but it was born of that experience in the pub as well, and seeing what, power when exercised unjustly, the terrible impact it can have on people. And so I wanted to do something positive, and that led me ultimately to work as an advisor to the corrections minister. So I was his corrections advisor, emergency services, counter-terrorism as well. So I was busy, but I loved that job. It was incredibly intense. It was like a 8-day-a-week job in a way. But the one aspect that interested me most about that work was the corrections side of things.
Mark, you said in an interview once before that you learned so much about the prison system, and then you said this. You learned that the corrections department is just a warehouse for the poor, the mentally ill, and those with substance abuse. Now, your latest book, Eden, which we'll come to talk about briefly at the end, is about somebody who spent time in prison. Could you talk about that really disillusioning impact of your work, of you coming to that view that it's just a warehouse for the poor, the mentally ill, and those with addiction issues?
Yeah, look, we essentially have the same cohort cycling through the prison system again and again and again. I mean, the recidivism rate is pretty stubbornly stuck on about 40%, I think, Australia-wide, higher in the Northern Territory, which means that for every 2 out of 5 prisoners after exiting prison will be back in jail within 2 years. And
I was seeing this happen. You know, I saw the inside of every prison in Victoria, and what I learned, I suppose, was dispiriting to see that. Also, just the kind of I guess the impotence in a way of some of the initiatives in addressing those problems, because they are society-wide issues. They're not something you can just fix in a prison or in contact with the justice system. They're broader social justice issues.
How do you keep people going into that prison system in the first place?
Exactly. Because once you have that contact, chances are you'll have repeated contact. So that was really, I guess, tough to witness. But also, I guess the reality of political life is that you want to be seen to be tough on crime. So we were kind of, cooking up the most draconian measures that we could in prisons and outside of the prison environment too, in community corrections.
And that a lot of that's pressure from the media. I've heard you talk about, the whole mantra of tough on crime.
That's right.
So I want to take you to the next step, and I want to talk about two things that are connected: class and luck. Australians like to think that we are a classless society, that we are a meritocracy, the land of the fair go. What do you think about that? Is that right?
I think, if you looked at my father's story, you might say that it is right. You could say, that he sort of pulled himself up by his bootstraps. He was this migrant who came to Australia and made good from incredibly humble background. But I think that those were very different circumstances at that time. I think Australia was a very different place. I think housing affordability was very different. The ability to, I suppose, rise above the situation that you were born into was greater at that point in time. I think that nowadays it's incredibly tough for people to overcome the circumstances that they're born into, particularly if they're born into difficult circumstances. I don't believe that we are a meritocracy, I suppose, in that kind of jingoistic way that we like to believe. I don't think we are really the land of a fair go. I think that a lot of people struggle throughout their lives and are basically sold this message that, if you don't make it, to a large extent, it's your fault.
Well, that idea of if you have a go, you'll get a go.
Yeah. And I just don't think that is true. I think we're a product of our environment. I think there is just so many things beyond our control that affect our chances in life. Everyone is doing their best, no one is seeking to fail in life. Everyone is trying to live a good life. And I think increasingly we are becoming, a very unequal society. We're more unequal in Australia than most countries in the OECD now. I think that the top 1% control more wealth than the bottom 60% combined. So these are very real issues, and they're big issues, and I guess that's what I'm driving at in terms of, like, from the justice side of things, that it's not necessarily something that can be fixed by a rehabilitation program inside a prison.
So let's talk about the sort of the related concept of luck. You've written pieces about luck, and it's very much its unacknowledged role in our lives. I'm going to ask you, you had one piece of good luck and one piece of bad luck within a space of a few years that were life-changing for you. Let's talk about the good luck, first of all. In 2010, at the age of 32, you're getting a little bit disillusioned with this work for reasons you've talked about. You're interested in writing when you were younger. You go and see a careers counsellor and you start to think you might quite like to do some writing again. You need some money to do that because you need to move to part-time work. So what do you do?
I would debt to one of my brothers here, because I was talking to him about my dilemma, essentially, that I needed some cash. I had a mortgage at that stage, so the idea of making a leap to being a writer was a big one, and I had a fair understanding that writing was not the most lucrative business to be involved in. He sent me an entry form for Millionaire Hot Seat, the Eddie Maguire show. And I thought, what are you doing? I'm not interested in doing this. He's like, no, you're always good at trivia. Why don't you give it a shot? You get some cash and it could really change things for you. You could do, pursue your writing, do a writing course, whatever it is. And so I did. I entered, and long story short, I ended up on the show. I remember it was when the Channel 9 studios were down in Richmond, and I was on the last show they were filming for the day. I was incredibly nervous going on. Like I hadn't told anyone that I was going on the show. I took a sickie from work that day, and I was convinced really that I'd humiliate myself on national TV. That I'd be that guy who bombs out on the very, very first question, something incredibly easy.
But what happened?
I ended up in the hot seat for the very last question, just by some fluke. And it was a question about comic book superhero, the Green Lantern. And I'd read a lot of comic books when I was a kid, but I'd never read the Green Lantern. And so it was multiple choice about where does he derive his superpower from. And there was his like power belt, his power shoes, I think it's power cape or something, and his power ring. And I did not know the answer. I did not know. And I was sitting there going, oh, God. And so in the end, I just plucked one out, which was power ring. And I was lucky enough to get it right.
So you won $50,000, and that enabled you to move to part-time work and to start a course in writing at RMIT. A couple of years after that, in 2012, you're a victim of a piece of very bad luck, which becomes equally life-changing. What happened then?
Yeah, so I was part-time at work, and it was on my day off. I was one of those people who like to ride around on an expensive Italian racer in Lycra, and I was riding up to, there's a spot in Melbourne in Kew called the Yarra Boulevard, which is a beautiful spot to ride, and I was heading up there on my lunch break, and I was hurtling down Brunswick Street in North Fitzroy, which, if listeners are familiar with it, it's a very busy area. There's trams, a lot of traffic, a lot of pedestrians. And a car turned right in front of me at an intersection. It didn't look for me, and I slammed on the brakes. I went flying over the handlebars. I separated my collarbone from my shoulder, broke some ribs. I had to have two operations on my shoulder. I had a metal plate inserted, and it was an incredibly painful experience, but incredibly painful recovery as well. I was out of action for about 6 months. The driver, I should say, he fled the scene as well. So that was a really, I guess, it was an unlucky event, but in some ways it was a bit of good fortune, because it brought things into really stark relief for me, because I realised, I guess, that, for a second or two either way, it could have been a far more serious accident. It could have been a fatal incident. I could have been run over, and good night. And so I got to think, what's really important to me in my life, and of course family and those close to me, but also my writing. I just realised that I've really got to focus on this and give it a proper go. And so that's what led me to leave my permanent ongoing job to kind of jump into the very precarious career of being a writer.
So I want to ask you about that. You've had 5 books that have been your fifth one's about to come out, Eden. They've been very successful in Australia. In terms of Australian writers, you're one of our most successful. You've won great international prizes. Your books sell well. They get very well reviewed. There's a lot of talk about how difficult it is for writers to make a living here in Australia. How does it work for you? That's your full-time job now, writing. Are you able to support yourself fully on what you earn from your writing?
Not solely from my writing, no. I rely on kind of writing adjacent activities, I suppose. Like I do mentorships through the Australian Society of Authors. I do manuscript assessments as well. library appearances every now and again, school appearances, but I'm also very reliant on getting government grants as well. As you know, writing a novel takes an enormous amount of time, and you have to be deep inside the work for a very, very long period. And that does not lend itself well to sort of kind of having a portfolio career of having a couple of other jobs. I know some writers do that by necessity. For me, I can't. For me to produce my work, I need to be really focused on it for a long period. So I'm dependent on getting government grants. In saying that, even with the grants, even with those other activities related to writing, with royalties coming in every now and again, the occasional advance from my publisher, it's a struggle. It's a struggle, and it's a very precarious existence. You can't plan for the future. It's very tough in that respect. Forget about superannuation or anything like my super. I haven't put a cent into it since I worked at Department of Justice. So it is a financially precarious career,
but worth it.
Oh, there's nothing else I would want to be doing. Basically, I love it. I absolutely love it. I love it's the same as when I was like a kid and when I'd write, and I guess everything else would disappear, and in kind of an modern parlance, I suppose I was in flow, as people would say, but I really was the whole world would disappear. I'd just be inside that imaginary world creating these characters. And that is the exact same experience for me now when I'm writing a book. I just love being inside of it, even though, my characters are often in really difficult circumstances. I want to make it real. I want to connect with readers. I want them to have a sense of what it's like for those characters. But, the biggest kind of validation for me, or the most satisfying aspect of being an author, isn't, awards, it isn't critical reception or any of that. It's really two things. It's the moment when I feel like I've finally finished the book and it's working. And that's before it's even accepted by my publisher. But I just know it's essentially done. The other aspect is when you hear from readers, when you have readers come up to you
at festivals and events at libraries and things. Yeah.
Oh, it's magic. It's absolutely magic, because you've created this imaginary world, with these, words on a page, and they've gone away and created something bigger out of it in their own mind, and they'll have their own interpretation of it. My books they don't tend to have very neat endings in a way. And so that they kind of imagine what the characters are doing now, and it's just the best thing. It's just the best thing, and that's what keeps me coming back to the page.
Mark, thank you so much. Your next book, as I've said, Eden, your fifth novel, also crime fiction. And just as a little teaser for readers, if you loved Mark's first book, Wimmera, there's a secret connection between the first and this latest one. I won't say more, but it's a really fabulous read, and I wish you all the very best with it.
Oh, thanks so much, Nicole. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for speaking to us.
Thank you.
That was Mark Brandi with freelance writer Nicole Abadee on the latest Good Weekend Talks. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate and comment wherever you get your podcasts, and keep tuning in for more compelling conversations. Coming soon, we talk with Australian portrait painter Vincent Fantuzzo about growing up on the wrong side of the tracks with crippling dyslexia, but prevailing through art. Good Weekend Talks is brought to you by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Proud newsrooms powered by subscriptions. To support independent journalism, search Subscribe Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. This episode of Good Weekend Talks is produced by Conrad Marshall and edited by Tim Mummery, with technical assistance from Cormac Lally. Tammy Mills is our executive producer, Tom McKendrick is head of audio, and Greg Callahan is the acting editor of Good Weekend.